the personality website Kiersley, which is a temperament methodology based off of the Myers-Briggs system, they type Donald Trump correctly, in my view, as a ESTP, an extroverted, sensing, thinking perceiver. So the way some of the words that describe a ESTP, these are also known as the artisan promoters. Artisan being people who have the SP combination, the sensor perceivers, and then the ESTPs in particular are known as promoters. And so some of the qualities that tend to capture their persona, their essence, is that they're magnetic, they're present, like more in the moment, they're unpredictable, they're risk-taking, proactive, and they're tactical. So now so you can see why Trump is so compelling in these live forums and these major crowds where he has the attention on television and unscripted ways that it plays to his dynamism, his off-the-cuff commentary. He sense the crowd, sense the emotions. But where his weaknesses come is that he, like most ESTPs, he has a harder time with concepts, with strategy, with scripted remarks. And so one of the problems here is not that the ESTP personality is any better or worse, but the reality is that the vast majority of people who make it in Washington as professionals in politics, as professionals in the policy apparatus, far from being ESTPs, actually tend to come from personality types that are the precise opposite of ESTPs. Now, a big part of the reason is the education system. So as I've argued in previous videos, usually what you have is that the K through 12 system tends to be oriented primarily for SJ types. These are the sensor judgers. And I would argue in particular the SFJs, the sensor feeler judgers, just because a lot of the teachers and bureaucrats in the education system are women who are more oriented around emotions and feeling. But then when you get into the higher education system at the college, and especially at the postgraduate level, you usually end up seeing that the intuitives are at an advantage. So the NTs are at an advantage because they're more rational, logical, analytical, and the NFs, the intuitive feelers, have their own advantages because they are intellectual and conceptual, but also they tend to thrive in particular in like the arts and some of the social sciences because they can bring an emotional sensibility to fields like psychology or whatever. And it's really the SPs in particular that get screwed in the educational system, where so like, for example, one of the most common differentiators between an intuitive and a sensor is that the more someone is on the intuitive side of the spectrum, the more inclined they are to read and to learn by reading books and whatever. And then also intuitives tend not to be as like present in the moment. But they tend to be better at forecasting, at thinking about the past, thinking about the future, playing out different scenarios, but they're not as here and now, and so often they're less charismatic and less able to be out in the public. I mean, I've spent more time than I would care to admit analyzing and studying and researching Donald Trump, and I'll say this only with a little bit of sarcasm. Although he's written several books that have all been bestsellers, I mean, the only evidence that I've seen, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but the only evidence I've seen that Donald Trump has learned a thing from reading a book is his fascination with Nazi propaganda. I mean, it's a little sick, but I think that's the reality. But what ends up happening is that basically you have a guy like Trump, especially in this political environment dominated by cable news, live media, social media, it very much plays to the strengths of a ESTP. And that's why he took the political world by storm and was so effective on the campaign trail. But the problem is that two things happened. One is that Trump never really I haven't seen a lot of evidence that he put much attention or care into really preparing for how to govern, how to really wield control of the bureaucracy, how to negotiate with members of Congress, how to actually like move the policy machinery to get things done. And I don't think this is because he's lacking in policy intuition. I actually think, and I've argued all along, that he actually does have a fairly well-considered worldview. But that's not enough for getting policy done. And then his problems are compounded by the fact that because he never put in the care to really surround himself with advisors, with a team of people who really get him, who really understand not only what his policy worldview is, but also what his leadership style is, what his management style is, and how to be responsive to him, that he ended up inheriting a lot of the ordinary policy crowd that would be there for any presidency. Only the problem is that whereas with what you get with conventional politicians, usually by the time they become president, you get the A team of advisors and experts. Trump didn't even really have that privilege, as I've talked about in other things. The only really clear differentiator between the people who joined Trump and have been loyal to him and those who haven't is the fact that they're disproportionately just B team people. These are just mediocre people who have a chip on their shoulder about not being included in from sort of more well-known experts, and they saw their opportunity to get in early with a candidate who had a void of advisors, and in some sense to basically get over promoted. So now, not only does he have a group of people who are not particularly talented, but now he also has people who nevertheless come from a conventional background. So these are people who usually got there into these jobs by going to a decent college or graduate school. They might work at a think tank. They might work in some kind of a writing intensive or research intensive job. A lot of them are obviously lawyers. And this phenomenon is true in spades when it comes to speechwriters. So if you look at the people in Washington who tend to be professional speech makers or speechwriters, what you usually end up seeing is that these like the very common or typical profile of the Washington speechwriter is someone who's intellectual, very literate, very articulate. They usually go to a top school, usually like a top 5 or 10 undergraduate school. And these are basically people who are also, in addition to being academic and intellectual, they're also well connected with a certain policy crowd. Maybe because they interned at a think tank or whatever else. And so basically these are like the young people who everyone knows are smart, everyone knows are hardworking, but they don't have like the requisite experience usually, or the political foundation or mandate to really hold a senior policy job. And so they usually end up being in a speechwriting job. And then some of these people transition from speechwriting to doing other things, like policy jobs or whatever else, but the people who really stick with the speechwriting thing are really these intellectual types. They're usually people they're almost all intuitives. The men are usually, I would say, INTJ, INTP. The women are often INFJ. Occasionally, maybe you'll get an INFP. You'll also see sometimes ENFPs, ENFJs, ENTJs, but these are all basically intuitives, either the rationals or the intuitives, the NFs. And so you could see like what happens with a speech like the one Trump gave, which is a prepared speech, but also a primetime speech, that in the formulation and crafting of the speech, you usually have a lot of different stakeholders involved. So you'll have, first of all, like someone at the White House will make a determination that they want to give a speech. So this would involve like the communications team, the political team, the policy team, and then maybe the president, but certainly senior people at the White House will talk about what their strategy is, what the messaging will be that they want. And this will happen obviously in conjunction and negotiation with members of Congress, with people at think tanks, with members of the press corps. And then ultimately it'll be up to the speechwriters to actually write this all down. And then once the speech is written, it'll go around for clearance and feedback. And so at the end of the day, you end up getting this like compromise thing with a very supposedly well thought out strategy with very fancy terms and messaging. The only problem is that if the guy who has to deliver it, it's not his voice, it's not his message, it's not his tone, you end up getting what you got last night from Trump, which is a totally jilted, disoriented, unpersuasive, uncompelling speech that only, in my view, made his policy problem worse.